want to go ahead and start the recording. I'd like to introduce Dr. Brian Taylor. He's actually over at UNC and is an assistant professor in biology, although, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but your degrees are in mechanical, right?
Yep, you've got it.
So kind of out of place over there in biology. You know, I don't want to speak for him, but I think there's an opportunity here, hopefully when we listen to a seminar, to identify some areas where we could collaborate with him, because I think there's certainly some overlap with what he does and with what some of our faculty do. Let's see. So prior to UNC, Brian, you were at AFRL, right?
Correct.
Okay, and then and let's see, your degrees are all from Case Western.
Mm-hmm.
Aerospace.
Hello. Hello.
It looks like Landon froze there.
Oh no.
Okay, you're back.
Am I back now?
You're back
Yes.
now.
Sorry about that. Okay, Brian, I'm gonna pass it over to you.
Okay, all right.
Take over.
Thank you very, very much for having me. So like I said, I'm at UNC in the biology department, which is kind of interesting. And so I'll talk about that a little bit. So this is about my lab's work on bio and bioinspired magnetic reception and multimodal sensing. I've been told that sometimes my headphones can end up being a little garbly or unclear. So if anything I say is unclear, let me know. I have a backup. So, all right. So let's see, we're gonna hope that this all behaves itself. So, all right. So the first question here is, why is an engineer in the biology department? How did this happen? And so with the research work that I've done and the training I have, the thing I've come to really learn and appreciate is that there's a lot of things we want to do in engineered systems that biological systems do, right? There's a lot of these tasks that we care about in man-made systems that parallel the things we see animals do every day. One of these areas is navigation. Navigation is critically important for both engineered systems and animals. So I've got two maps on the left here, one from Delta Airlines routes to show you where in the world you could go from JFK in New York. This is pre-pandemic, so that this might be a little slimmer now because with travel restrictions and things. But so we've got a global route map from Delta Airlines, and we have a global shipping traffic map below that. So this is just to emphasize that navigation is a critically important thing in our modern world, right? I mean, it's something we've cared about for hundreds of years. How do you know where you are and get to where you want to go, especially when you're trying to go around the globe, right? Now, if we look to animals, animals actually parallel this, right? Navigation is critically important for animals to find food, find mates, evade predators, find locations that are find and stay within locations that are ecologically favorable to them. So what I've got here is let's see, here we go. I've got a map of monarch butterfly migration. So this is showing how monarch butterflies will migrate from multiple locations in the US all the way down to central Mexico. And they do this over multiple generations, which is really wild. That's another story in and of itself. And then down here, I've got a map showcasing some points at which loggerhead sea turtles have been observed on their migratory journey. And so loggerhead sea turtles are born on the east coast of the US, and then they'll go out into the Atlantic Ocean, and they'll actually circumnavigate the ocean. As they mature, they'll take up residence at a feeding ground, and then when it's time for them to have children, to lay their eggs, they will migrate back to the same beach that they were born on to lay their eggs. So it would be like if I decided, you know what, I want to have children. It would be like me getting up and walking to the hospital I was born in Queens to have children, but without anyone telling me that I was born at a hospital in Queens or giving me a map to tell me how to get from Chapel Hill to Queens, right? So the take home here is this, that navigation is critically important for engineered systems and biological systems. Okay, so how do you do this, right? How do you do this long distance navigation thing? In engineered systems in the modern world, the answer is satellite-based navigation. So, GPS in the US, there's also GLONASS in Russia, there's Beidou in China, Galileo in the EU. These are all satellite-based navigation systems. You have a constellation of satellites, and this constellation of satellites can tell you where you are and what time it is. Satellite-based navigation is a wonderful thing. It helped me with this thing, my phone. I was able to get from Florida up to North Carolina. It helped me find where the grocery store was. The problem is that satellite-based navigation is really expensive, right? It costs the US, last time I checked, I think it's something like billions of dollars every year to field and maintain its GPS system. Satellite-based navigation can also become unavailable or unreliable for a variety of reasons. Some of these are man-made and some of these are natural. Some of these are rather innocuous. I mean, if you just are in a city, you can have satellite signals bouncing off of buildings and things, and this is where your phone, and this has happened to me before, this is where your phone could tell you that you ran like 8 miles in 4 minutes because it got confused about where you were. But some of these are also, some of the reasons it can go away or become unreliable are actually due to nefarious intent. So there are people who will try to do things to trick or fool or spoof GPS. And then there are people who will do things just to outright deny your ability to use GPS where you are. So that's a problem. Also, satellite-based navigation does not work underwater. So this is a really big problem because if you're trying to do any type of underwater task, you can surface to get a navigation fix, but once you go underwater, you need inertial navigation or you need some other type of navigation system to help you figure out where you are and get to where you want to go. Increasingly, also, we want engineered systems to navigate autonomously. So be able to get from point A to point B on your own and maybe even deal with some of the problems in the middle. Now, the benefit is if we do this all right, we actually can control how these systems work, and that's going to be important for a little bit later. Now, if we look to biology, biology is very different. That I know of, turtles, birds, insects, they don't call NASA or SpaceX to launch satellites into space so that they can figure out where they are. Biology just gets what it's born with. So animals get local, natural, continuously available senses. So they get what they can see, smell, taste, touch, and hear, but they also get Earth's magnetic field, a lot of which we call magnetoreception. There's a lot of animals, a lot of taxa that can sense the magnetic field and use it in conjunction with these other senses to help them navigate from point A to point B. And this helps animals engage in long distance migration across continents and oceans. When I say a lot of taxa have magnetoreception, we see it in turtles, reptiles, we see it in some insects like bagong moths, we see it in some newts and salamanders, we see it in various birds, it's in various fish, it's in some arthropods like Caribbean spiny lobsters, some crustaceans like Caribbean spiny lobsters. It's in some bacteria, right? It's in a lot of different types of organisms, and it helps them, again, navigate long distances. So to me, this is really cool because, we've spent as humans hundreds of years at developing tools and techniques to figure out where you are and how to get from point A to point B. And meanwhile, animals have been able to can do this just with what they're born with, right? So to me, that like when I first started learning about all this stuff, it really floored me. Animals also, no pun intended, are living, breathing examples of autonomous systems. And the catch here is that we don't really know how magnetoreception works in animals. We know that animals can sense the magnetic field, but if you ask me how you see, I can tell you that. If you ask me how you hear, I can tell you that. If you ask me how an animal senses the magnetic field, I will tell you that there are 2 hypotheses and that there's evidence for and against both of them. In 2021, this is an active research area, how animals sense the magnetic field. Another active research area, which we'll talk about today, is how do you use the field to get from point A to point B? So this is an area where I think that biology and engineering behave. Let's see. There we go. Where biology and engineering can help each other, and in fact are not that different. So if there's a lot of things we can sense in the world, and at the end of the day, whether you're an animal or an engineered system, you have to detect the world around you, maybe using an optical sensor like an eye or an optical sensor like a camera. Once you detect the world around you, you have to process it and figure out what it means. So engineered systems get some type of computing architecture, and biological systems have a computing architecture. It's called a nervous system and a brain, right? That's what a nervous system is. It's a biological computer at really at the core of things. And then once you process all that information, you got to do something with it. So if you are an animal, this might be, again, finding mates, finding food, seeking shelter so you can rest, all right, or so you can grow. If you're an engineered system, this might be delivering a package across the Pacific. It might be trying to find someone who's having a heart attack or a stroke or who's in labor. So as an engineer, I solve problems, and the problem I want to solve is designing systems that can navigate without having to rely on satellites. Well, animals, again, no pun intended, are living, breathing examples of autonomous systems that navigate without using satellites. It's probably a good idea to understand what animals are doing here, because if we can understand what animals are doing, that might give us ideas about principles and concepts that we can leverage to make better engineered systems. But likewise, like I said, we don't fully understand how navigation and how magnetoreception work in animals. And it's a hard thing to study in animals. It's hard you can't really release a lot of turtles into the North Atlantic Ocean, have them all migrate, track them all over their lifetime. And then when that's done, say, now I will release a new experimental batch and change the salinity of the Atlantic Ocean like that. You can't do that. But there are a lot of tools and techniques we can leverage from, including robotics and things with computational neuroscience, to try to get a better understanding of how magnetoreception and processing of the magnetic field might actually work. So the bottom line is, if we learn about what's going on with animals, there's a lot that we could potentially take into engineered systems to better our engineered systems. But if we use engineered systems, we can also get a better idea of how animals work and do what they do. And let's see, I have to go here. This for me is why this is why an engineer is in the biology department looking at animal navigation. My lab's objectives are really to understand magnetoreception and multimodal sensing for navigation. So I'm in a biology department. So I really do want to understand about animal navigation and behavior for a variety of conservation and ecological reasons. And other scientific reasons. But at my core, I'm an engineer. You can see the Legos on top of my bookshelf here. At the end of the day, I want to learn principles that I can use to make better engineered systems, because I want to design and build things, right? And to do this in my lab, we use a very multi and interdisciplinary approach. I think I counted how many disciplines are represented in my lab in terms of just the specific people. I think right now we're up to like 6 or 7. We use everything from robotics to biological behavior to computational neuroscience to really try to understand how this magnetic reception and multimodal sensing thing works. So before I get into the specific work we're doing, I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the magnetic field, just so that we're all on the same page. When I go to use certain words, everyone will know what I'm talking about. I find that especially doing interdisciplinary work, a lot of words are overloaded. So like if you say optimal to one person, that means something very different to someone else. So want to just make sure we're all in the same spot. Okay. All right. So as you are now aware, Earth has a magnetic field. And it's not unlike a bar magnet. You could actually treat Earth as a bar magnet to a first approximation. So the Earth's magnetic field, it's a vector field, goes from the surface of the Earth up through the atmosphere. And because it's a vector field, there's a number of components we can use to describe it. The two that I'm going to talk about here today are intensity, or just the magnitude of that vector. So this is the strength of the magnetic field at any given point, and the inclination angle. So inclination is the angle that the field makes relative to the horizontal of the Earth. So it points, as you can see here, it points out of the Earth in the southern hemisphere, it's parallel to the Earth at the magnetic equator, and then it points into the Earth in the northern hemisphere. Like I said, there's other components like declination, and there are other coordinate systems and even features of the magnetic field, but not going to talk about those today. They are important, and we're actually doing some work on these, but I'm just not going to get into them today. So the take home here is that we have intensity and inclination. And I could go out right now with a magnetometer and measure these things, right? I could go out, I could go right outside of my apartment with a magnetometer and measure intensity and inclination. Or if I had a computer model, if I had a model of the magnetic field in the world, I could go to any point in the world and measure and compute, intensity and inclination. And if I do that in enough locations, I can play a game of connect the dots and connect points of constant magnetic intensity and inclination. And by doing that, I can draw lines of constant intensity and inclination, just like the level curves on a contour on a terrain map to figure out, locations of constant elevation or areas of constant elevation, or you might, if I was going to draw like isotherms on some type of like a weather map. And so if I were to do that, I would get a picture that looks like this. This is a picture of the world on lines of constant inclination. And then I could also overlay onto that lines of constant intensity, right? And so the big thing to note here is that, these lines of inclination and intensity in some regions, like in the central to southern Atlantic, these things look almost perpendicular. In other regions, like the northern Atlantic, these lines are almost parallel to one another. The lines of inclination and intensity here, they're also, they're not just this perfectly like straight, they're not this rectilinear entity, right? There's a lot of curviness in this environment. So that's going to come up in a bit. Okay. So with all of that, what does my lab do? What do we do? So what I'm going to talk about is a lot of our work on behavior. And when I say behave here, or when I talk about behavior, what I mean by that is given what you sense right now, how do you go from point A to point B? Again, behavior is one of those words that seems to have a lot of meanings to a lot of different people. So when I say behavior, just given what you sense, how do you go from point A to point B? And there are a lot of hypotheses or ideas about how animals might do this using the Earth's magnetic field. I'm not going to talk, so we've done work in all of these areas, but I'm only going to talk about these so-called magnetic signatures or addresses today. So what do I mean by a magnetic signature? Well, if we look at this picture here of the central and southern Atlantic, so we've got South America over here on the left and Africa over here on the right. If you look at this blue dashed line of constant intensity, and the lines that kind of are shaped similar to that are also lines of constant intensity, and we look at this solid red line of constant inclination, you see that they intersect at this one point, this triangle, and they only intersect at that point. So this point is kind of like has a unique combination of intensity and inclination. And it kind of, and if you could sense this triangle or the features that are common to that triangle, that tells you something about where you are. So it's like this set of inclination, and this combination of intensity and inclination is sort of like a unique signature or an address that marks this particular location. It's just like if you had an XY grid, right? I mean, if you're at the point, X is 5 and Y is 12, that's a unique combination of parameters that marks that specific location. It's a unique signature, an address. Another way to think of it from a more sensory perspective is if I dropped you off in a location and you saw the Empire State Building in Times Square, you know that you're in New York. If I then drop you off at another location and you see, and you see that you're at the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial, you're at the National Mall, right? You can have unique sets of visual features that tell you where you are. It's the same thing. You can have unique set of magnetic features that tells you where you are. So if I can sense something that magnetically speaking looks like this dot down here, and I know I want to get to this triangle, I could theoretically form a vector or form a direction that would help take me from the dot to the triangle, right? And especially in this environment, in this down here in the central and southern Atlantic, these lines of inclination and intensity, again, they look kind of like a grid. It's a very warped and twisted grid, but it's a grid. So there's actually ideas out there, or notions in the biology literature that where we think that some animals might actually use combinations of inclination and intensity to delineate, to mark specific locations, or maybe mark regions that help, or maybe mark, or maybe able to use these combinations to help them identify regions that would be ecologically favorable for them to stay in. And so the question is this type of a hypothesis, or these other two hypotheses, which I'm not going into today, are these valid models or hypotheses? Because the way these things are always posed is, based on really awesome behavioral data and really awesome animal experiments. These are not easy experiments to do. We can see that animals respond to inclination and intensity. And so maybe from that, you can infer that an animal might be able to, that an animal might be able to use these two properties separately to denote different locations. But that's just a hypothesis. We don't know that for certain, and we haven't been able to identify that. And there's a lot of reasons why, just like that could work, there's also a lot of reasons why that might fail miserably. So the question for us is this a valid model or hypothesis? And if it is, how might it work? Can we get an idea of how feasible this hypothesis is? From an engineering perspective, if we want to estimate our location, like a location based on sensor information and a model, we have Kalman filters and particle filters. If we want to do something like object recognition, we have deep learning and all these other things, right? We have all these different algorithms and methods and tools for processing information, figuring out what's going on in the world around you. So the question is, what can this magnetic signatures-based strategy tell us about, what information can it give us that will be helpful in an engineered system? Okay, so moving forward. So with respect to a signatures-based strategy, this is actually something we implemented, and it's really kind of simple at its core. What we have is a little agent, an artificial animal or vehicle, this blue dot here, and it's in a magnetic field environment. So that's this kind of multicolored grid that it's lying up against, or lying on top of, and we're trying to go to this target, this red target here. So all we do is just say, well, if you can sense the inclination and intensity of where you are, and you know the inclination and intensity of where you want to go, at least in the sensory space, you could form a vector that points from where you are to where you want to go, and they just move in that direction. Now, if you're a flying animal or a swimming animal, or if you're a flying vehicle or a swimming or a marine vehicle, you're going to get pushed off course by ocean currents or winds, right? So we can even add in an ocean current that might push you off course a little. And so you might not get exactly to the target, but you will move closer to the target. Now, if you have no ocean current, and if your magnetic field is a perfectly rectilinear orthogonal grid, this is kind of uninteresting because you'll just move in straight lines to the goal. But as I showed you earlier, the magnetic field is not a orthogonal rectilinear grid, right? It's this twisted, curvy, warped thing. And so you might not, so the question then becomes, can this strategy even work that's in an environment like that? And can it work in an environment that's like that, where you also have an ocean current that pushes you off course, and where you have things like sensor noise, right? Or where there's noise in the sensors or noise in the environment. So with this strategy, what we can do is vary the measurement noise. So how much noise is in your sensors, how often we take measurements, we can vary the strength or the type of ocean current and see if the strategy can still work. Now, as far as magnetics, if we're going to look at magnetic signatures, we should look at an animal that uses, or we think uses, magnetic signatures. And so the animal picked for this is loggerhead sea turtles. So again, loggerhead sea turtles are born on the east coast of the US. They'll get into the Atlantic Ocean, and they'll actually circumnavigate the Atlantic Ocean before taking up residence in like a feeding ground. So these are different locations that have been where we've seen loggerhead sea turtles in their migratory route. So they're in the central and northern Atlantic. So let's take a look at the magnetic field in the central and northern Atlantic. And again, we know loggerhead sea, well, the evidence suggests that loggerhead sea turtles can sense inclination and intensity and use these two separate properties to help them navigate. So if we look at the inclination and intensity in the North Atlantic Ocean, so the purple here is the lines of intensity, green is lines of inclination, and the black outlines are the continents. What we have is a magnetic field where the lines of inclination and intensity go from southwest to northeast. And we have lines that are almost parallel. There's nothing perpendicular here. And we have some little magnetic anomalies, or we have some little magnetic noise. So up in here, you can see there's places where the magnetic field doesn't follow a spatially averaged trend. Let's see. Oh, and the magnetic field, as I said before, is curvilinear. So when I first looked at this, I said, you know, this looks like a lot. This looks like it might be really hard. Oh, and by the way, I also didn't mention, there's also this giant there's this thing called the North Atlantic Gyre. It's a giant ocean current that goes around the Northern Atlantic. So there's a lot that's going on just in the Northern Atlantic Ocean. And I said, you know, this is a lot. So what I decided to do is I said, let me see if I can get the strategy we came up with to work in a really simplified environment. So I'm going to start really, really simple. And if I can get that to work, I can kind of bootstrap myself up to progressively more realistic environments. And by doing this, I can really get an idea of how does this strategy work? How does it tick? Where does it work? Where does it break? Why does it break? And then based on that, we can really try to see, you know, is this something that you could actually use for an animal system or an engineered system? And if not, what might you have to do to it to make it work? So, you know, my bachelor's was aerospace engineering, and through all my degrees, aerospace engineering has not failed me yet. So I said, let me go back to, let's take a look at aerospace engineering. How can I do this? And the answer was to borrow from aerodynamics. So if you think about a lifting cylinder, you know, that was Mangus effect, where, you know, you spin like if you drop a ball, use the videos where you drop a ball off of a dam, and because you're rotating this ball through the air, it generates a lift force, so it'll curve the trajectory of the ball. So it's like a lifting cylinder in aerodynamics. And if you look at the velocity potential contours from that, and that's what's on the left, and the streamlines from that, that's what's on the right, you notice that you have two sets of contour lines. So what I decided to do is I said, let me use these as proxies for inclination and intensity, right? Because by doing that, now what the benefit of this is, with this environment, I can control how curvilinear or rectilinear it is. I can make it be just like a grid, or I can make it be this very curvy thing. It's actually got an anomaly at the origin. There's a singularity. So we have at the origin, it doesn't follow the magnetic field doesn't follow a spatially averaged trend, just like the real world. And these these contour lines, wherever they intersect, they're perpendicular, but we can modify this so that we can make things be not perpendicular. So even though this is a very simplified environment, if I overlay these two sets of lines on each other, there's a lot of this actually has a lot of this actually captures a lot of the gross features we see in the magnetic field. And so with this environment, we could vary the curvilinearity, the orthogonality of the environment. We could even vary where the goal locations are and get a sense of how well does our signatures-based strategy work. And so we actually took this strategy that I showed you, right? We started it all, we put it into this environment. We started it off at this yellow point, and we said, migrate to all four of these points, do it 20 times. And lo and behold, it worked. This made me very, very happy. And we got this to work with we did a parametric study where, again, we varied measurement noise, measurement frequency, the curvilinearity of the environment. We varied the ocean current that's in this environment. And the system actually worked under a variety of conditions. And we even got some preliminary data that suggested it worked in a physical system as well. So then with Sabrina's help, so she was a student, she was an undergraduate student that I mentored for a summer when I was working at the Air Force. We actually did the same exact kind of a study, but rotating these lines so that now they're not orthogonal everywhere. And we still got things to work. So this gave me a lot of hope. It suggests that this signatures-based type of approach to navigation can actually work. it appears like this hypothesis is valid from a biological perspective. And again, robust is a word I'm always afraid of using because that means different things to different people. But this strategy appears to be somewhat robust in that we could change a variety of parameters to a variety of different values, and you could still actually get successful navigation to all 4 of these points, right? From an engineering perspective, what's really cool about this strategy is the strategy doesn't know anything about the environment. It doesn't have a detailed a priori map of the environment. It just has notional directions about what constitute moving north and south or east and west. And so what's nice about that is, as your if you were to actually build this, you wouldn't have to go out and survey an area, create a magnetic map, and then carry that map on board with you. And as you're navigating, every time you take a measurement, register yourself against that map and figure out where you are to figure out what you want to do. You can just put this, we literally just put this strategy in this environment, hit go, and it runs. So this could help save you on size, weight, power, and cost of the system because you don't have to, because you have a sort of a decreased computational load or computational requirements for the system. So from here, we kind of forked the system. We kind of forked this off into a variety of directions. We still want to understand what the North Atlantic, what's going on in the North Atlantic Ocean. We started implementing things in high fidelity and physical systems. We started looking at animal energetics, and we even started looking at some neurally based sensing and processing. So with respect to looking at the Northern Atlantic Ocean, again, this is a very, very toy environment that we have here. So to look at the Northern Atlantic, what we did is we said, let's start simple again. We're going to consider 2 sets of planes. And if we look at the level curves that define the different heights of these planes at different points, when we plot those level curves or contours out, we get this grid, okay? Well, if we spin this grid, if we spin these planes around, we now end up with contour lines that run from southwest to northeast, just like the lines in the North Atlantic Ocean. We end up with lines that are almost parallel to each other, just like the North Atlantic Ocean. We can even play tricks where we, maybe flip these planes around or weight them differently so that we can look at sort of different sensing variants that we can apply to our strategy. Now, one thing that is different here is that, these lines in the Northern Atlantic, they're not linear. And so as a result, the angle that that the inclination and intensity contours make with each other in the Northern Atlantic, it changes over space. Whereas with our environment, everything is just linear. But I'm okay with that because, again, we want to really try to understand when our strategy breaks, why does it break? And if we introduce a level of complexity right now, it might be harder to see if the strategy fails. Does it not work because the strategy is garbage, or does it not work because the strategy could work in some places but not others? So this helps us really get a good handle and intuition on how things work. So what we did is, with Maggie and Susan's help here, these are both, Maggie just graduated from UNC undergrad last year. Susan's getting ready to graduate this year. We took the same exact strategy that I told you about before. We put it started off at this yellow point. We put a bunch of points in this environment that look like the points that loggerhead sea turtles navigate to. And we said, okay, strategy, migrate to all of these different points. And when we did that, it actually worked. The system actually was able to navigate to all 8 of these goal points. And this made me very, very happy because this now is a system that looks a lot more like the real world, and it still seems to work. And remember, the strategy knows nothing about what the environment looks like. We didn't have to modify the strategy because, oh, well, the system is, now these lines are almost parallel, so we have to do something different. We took the same exact algorithm. We just literally copied and pasted in MATLAB, like this section of code goes here, and then we ran it, and it still works. So this made me very happy. We also started applying dynamical systems tools to try to understand, or try to predict when is a strategy going to be able to reach a goal point and when is it not going to reach a goal point. So up until this point, we had to kind of just look at trajectories and see whether the trajectories complete this full circuit. But if we treat a given goal point, let's say this blue point here, like a like an equilibrium point in a dynamical system, we can sort of ask, well, is that point stable? or is it unstable? And the way we can do that is just compute eigenvalues of the system. So what I'm showing for this one blue point here is the eigenvalues of that point, or the largest eigenvalue of that at that point as we vary the ocean current. And I'm showing these largest eigenvalue for two different variants of our sensing strategy. So to give you an idea, if you look at this so-called regular sensing variant that we have, with no ocean current, initially the largest eigenvalue of the system is positive, which means that the system is unstable. And when we actually ran the trajectory, the agent can't reach the first goal point. But if we increase the ocean current, eventually we drive the largest eigenvalue negative. But if all the eigenvalues are negative, that means the system is stable. It should get to the goal point. And when we actually went and checked the trajectory, when we ran the algorithm, the system's able to actually get to the first goal point. So we've done this kind of parametric study. Now we started using dynamical systems tools, and now we're starting to get into using control theory to see if a system is not going to succeed, what would you have to do to it to make it succeed? So this was really cool. And this has all been in simulation, and this is great. But remember, I talked about wanting to use physical devices as well. And so, because you can do whatever you want in simulation. You can always get a simulation to work. I think the phrase is that simulations are doomed to succeed. And so the proof is, okay, can we put this into some type of physical device or higher fidelity system? So we did that. So what we did is we took the same exact strategy I told you about, remember this kind of very simple thing, and we put it into two different robotic systems. So over on the left here, we have two iRobot creates being shown. So these are just repurposed Roombas that you can get, but you can hack them. And so we have a motion capture environment in my lab. And what Luke up here in the red shirt did is he got all of this up and running, and then he was able to put this algorithm onto this robot. The robot runs around in the environment, and the motion capture system can see where the robot is, and based on where it is, we can tell it what it senses. So it's still fictive sensing. However, the robot is completely untethered, which means that it's real world motion and control. So you run into problems where you say go straight and it veers off to the right or the left. You can have things happen where like hair and stuff gets wound up in the motors. The floor is not flat. All of these fun things that can, even if they're small, can actually wreak havoc on a system. And lo and behold, when Luke got this implemented, it actually successfully navigated to all of the goal points, just like in in the simulation. So this made me really happy. Andrew up here, who just graduated from UNC with highest honors last year from undergrad, he's double major in biology and computer science. He got what he did is a similar kind of a thing. He took this algorithm and put it into this rate table, right? And this rate table is just a robotic lazy Susan. And he then put a magnetometer on this table and put it in a magnetic environment where we can generate any magnetic field in the world. And so what we do is we give the magnetometer a magnetic field. Based on what it senses, the table will rotate and spin to point in a particular direction. And if we pretend that the table can actually trace out and translate, then we can make the table trace out trajectories. So we have basically a virtual reality magnetic tracking system here, where we can have the system run around like the Northern Atlantic, all from the comfort of Chapel Hill. And so we implemented this. So when he implemented this with the same exact environment from before and the same sensing strategy that we had, he actually got this thing to work. So it actually successfully migrated to all the points. And this made me really happy because this is using real world sensing, right? This is real world, no kidding magnetic fields that we're using here. And there's also real world, no kidding, like delays in the system. There's a delay between when you sense the magnetic field, process it, and then actually have to spin or move to do something. So we've started with this really simple environment where it's almost like a toy, but we stepped ourselves up to, two environments that actually, we still have a long ways to go, but these are much more realistic looking environments, and these are running in physical systems. So it tells us our simulations are not actually that off base. We're actually doing the right things. At least I think this tells us we're doing the right things. Now, all of the simulation work we did up to this point, one thing I did not tell you is that it's all kinematic. It's all just assuming that you're at a location, move at this speed to this new location. The real world doesn't work like that. The real world works based on dynamics, right? Some of the forces. Or if you're more of an analytical mechanics person, like figure out the Lagrangian and then use Lagrange's equations. And so and we wanted to really implement things with forces because some of the work we're getting into really, that makes life a lot easier to work with. And we can also then start looking at specific animals or specific engineered systems. We can look at really modeling what does a turtle do or what does a particular aircraft do, because now you've got the right dynamical properties. And so Cassie, who is a senior mechanical engineering student at Duke, she's getting ready to graduate. She actually started doing some work with us last summer. She actually implemented a dynamics-based simulation and then running the same exact algorithm that I told you about before. So now the only difference is instead of kinematics, it's dynamics. And when she started trying to test this against some of her earlier work, so this kind of simple square environment, things actually worked. She got the same results, which made me very happy. So now we've got a higher fidelity simulation, we've got a physical system where these things all seem to still work. This makes me happy. Okay, so everything I've told you about till now just sort of assumes that we can sense if we have inclination and intensity, and then we can just use that. But if you're an animal, you've got to process that information using the nervous system. So how do we do that? And the answer is Sebastian and Faye. So these are both, Faye just graduated from UNC undergrad last year, and Sebastian is doing an honors thesis right now. He's getting ready to graduate this spring. So what they both have been working on is using computational neuroscience, so mathematical representations of nervous system dynamics and how the nervous system works, to understand multimodal sensing and processing. And what Sebastian was able to do, and he got this is literally, we just got this data at 5:15 yesterday, so I'm very happy about this. What we did is using what's called a dynamic neural field. It's basically like, think of it as a sort of simplified version of a nervous, it's a sort of a mathematical model of how populations of neurons would work together. He's actually able to sense this magnetic field, process the information, and get it to use the same exact strategy I told you about before to navigate from a starting point to a target. And he can do this in multiple environments, when the environment is perfectly rectilinear, all the way to when the environment is curved, warped, and rotated. So this is really cool. I mean, because this is, again, giving us a good indication that, yeah, you could use this magnetic signatures type of a strategy, and it can work. It not only does it behaviorally work, it works on a neural level as well. So you can actually sense this information, process it in a neurally relevant way, and then execute it. And these are all things that an animal would be able to do. So this lets us know that the hypothesis, this is a reasonable hypothesis. Okay, the last bit I'm going to tell you about is Delaneys work. So Delaney has been modifying our work to be able to work with studying animal energetics. So studying the energetics of migrating animals is actually not a trivial thing to do, and it's hard to study the energetics of large, freely swimming animals. There are turtles that can weigh up to several hundred pounds. So we can do things like put tags on turtles to track where they go and measure, not only where they go, but measure the water the conditions of the environment around them, like salinity, water temperature, things like that. But the problem is when you put a tag on a turtle, it's going to modify the turtle's drag, which is going to impact how the turtle swims. And so we want to try to understand how do you better design tracking tags to minimize the impact on a turtle. You also want to understand, we also like to understand, oh dear, just the energetics of swimming animals. And also, if you think about animals, they are constantly balancing, how do I get from point A to point B, with when do I stop to eat? How much do I need to eat to get enough energy to get from point A to point B? Do I stop to eat here or here because in location one, maybe the food is better, but there's predators and I have a better chance of getting eaten? So when you look at it, it's really, how do you get from point A to point B subject to constraints of having to maintain yourself and refuel, which is very similar to what engineered systems do. So we think maybe there's things we can learn from this that maybe we could apply to things like the vehicle routing problem and logistics and supply chains. And our tagline for this in COVID times is, we will get you your toilet paper. So what Delaney did is modified our strategy. So this is the simple environment and this North Atlantic environment, so that as we navigate, our system loses energy. When our system loses enough energy right here, it turns and looks for a resource source distribution. That's this elliptical patch. And once it gets in this resource distribution, it feeds. And once it feeds enough, then it gets enough energy, then it goes back to migrating on its merry way. And so by looking at the energy capacity of the agent here, or the specific size and drag of a tag, we can we're starting to look at studying energetics questions around migrating animals. And we just submitted a paper, we just submitted a revised version of a paper to Journal of Theoretical Biology for this past Monday. I think I submitted it at 10 o'clock. So this has felt like a very long week. I think every day has felt like Friday, and I'm like, wait, no, it's not Friday yet. Which was sad, because I was looking, today is Friday, and I've been looking forward to this. So I'm very happy we're here. So just to wrap up, because I think I'm about at the end of my time, I've shown you some work we've done with behavioral strategies, and I've showed you a little bit of work we've done with neurally relevant sensing and processing. And both of these, we're using modeling, simulation, and robotics to understand how different strategies might work. In particular, we're verifying and validating hypotheses regarding behavior and sensing mechanisms and processing mechanisms. And again, one thing that we found is that, yeah, these are actually reasonable strategies. It's not just, well, yeah, this might work. No, we can actually build something from the ground up that actually generates desirable and reasonable behaviors. But we're also learning about things that might be useful for engineered systems. So again, we've learned things about how we can navigate without having to have a detailed map ahead of time. With our sensing work, which I haven't shown all of it here today, we're seeing how we can do things with multimodal sensing. Nervous systems are built to do multimodal sensing. You guys are all watching and hearing me right now, all while monitoring where you are over your support, and your head doesn't explode. Whereas if I tell my phone, schedule a meeting, that's got to go out to a data center, get processed, and then get sent back, right? So we're seeing how you can do multimodal sensing, near optimal estimation, and even looking at maybe how do you ideally place sensors to get the best information from an environment. I've introduced you to all of these people throughout the presentation. No one is an island, and I am so happy that I work with this group of people. Again, we have biology, computer science, quantitative biology, physics, mechanical engineering. Let's see. Okay, 6. And then we have biomedical engineering. Can't forget employees 1 and 2 down here. And then our postdoc, she has a PhD in biology, but before that, she was a software developer for Microsoft. So we have when I say multi and interdisciplinary, I'm really not kidding. We are multi and interdisciplinary. So with that, I thank you for listening and taking time out of your busy day to come and listen to this. I'd like to thank my collaborators, and also you got to always thank the hand that feeds you. And with that, I can take any questions.
Great, thank you, Brian. So let's open it up for questions. I think just go ahead and unmute and ask a question if you have one.
Hey, Brian, Greg Buckner here. That's fascinating presentation, great research. I'm aware that the Earth's magnetic field varies pretty substantially over decades and hundreds of years. Maybe something on the order of I don't know, 1 degree every 10 years. And if animals like loggerhead turtles are using, the Earth's magnetic field for navigation, is that like a disturbance that they're able to reject? Or is that something that basically causes their nesting sites to vary over hundreds of miles over the course of decades?
No, so this is a really good question. So there's been some evidence that we've seen where if you have let's see, lines of, I think it's, I want to say inclination, in some years where these lines have gotten closer together, you'll see like their nesting sites be more tightly clustered. And then when these lines split apart, you might see the density of their nesting clusters kind of spread. So it's definitely something that impacts them. This is actually one of the areas. So Delaney, she's actually my first grad student. She's literally, she's 2 months old. She started grad school in this past January. This is actually one of the areas that she's wanting to get into for her graduate work. And in terms of the magnetic field changing, so there's actually short period changes on the order of like days, weeks. There's longer period changes, like you mentioned, over the course of decades that are over maybe an animal's lifetime. But then there's also changes on the order of geologic and evolutionary time. So the magnetic field even has actually flipped around periodically. So something we want to look at, and I haven't really seen a whole lot of people look at this, is how do you deal with these, how does a strategy deal with these changes? Because as you allude to, whatever works for you has to work for your children and your children's children. And so is it a question of, I do not formally know the answer to this. We're not sure if maybe their nesting sites are kind of moving around, or if they have some way of, based on whatever imprinting they do when they're young, kind of calibrating themselves to whatever the field is, so that way so that even if though the field may walk around a little bit, they can still be pretty robust and come back to the same site. Am I getting at your question, or did I go like way into left field?
No, you definitely addressed it. It's an interesting project for sure, interesting hypothesis, and I think your answer was spot on. It would, I can see where what you just mentioned about the nesting site spreading and potentially moving as a function of changes in the Earth's magnetic field. That's something that would be interesting to investigate. Thanks so much.
I find myself asking for confirmation of if I've successfully answered questions, because I can't see people now. So
Yeah, hey, hi Brian. This is Chris Vermillion here. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thank you for the very nice presentation. Had a question about some of the material toward the end, where you presented a robotic agent who had to actually harvest their own resources in order to continue the mission, and you drew the diagram of a resource rich area that you would make a decision to go to and then carry on with the mission. What algorithms are you using to make that decision of whether to target a resource-rich area, which resource-rich area to target, and if the resource is more distributed over everywhere? For example, if we're harvesting, say, a wind resource, you've got wind practically everywhere, but in different quantities. So really everywhere is a recharging station, but some areas have better recharging stations than others. What algorithms is your group pursuing there, and how does, in your opinion, the appropriate algorithm differ based on whether the recharging resources are kind of discrete or everywhere, but quite varied in their intensity?
Okay, no, so that's a good question. So right now, again, this is I'm as you can see from the theme is always start simple and bootstrap yourself up. So right now what we do is basically our system runs kind of like for lack of better words, like a state machine. So we basically just run until you lose energy. And once you lose enough energy, we basically effectively are kind of using like a line of sight type of a deal, where we're just saying which resource distribution is closer. And based on which one is closer at that time, that's the one we go after. But since you can get pushed off course, you may get blown, but your path may change enough where maybe resource distribution A starts out as being closer, but then B starts off as B ends up being closer. So this is actually something we want to get at in the future, because so you can have these resource distributions, they're static, they don't move, but things are probably going to move around with the current and everything. So we want to definitely start getting some higher fidelity decision making, and as far as like you say, which thing do you go after? Should you be feeding? Which thing do you go after? Where do you go after this? We haven't implemented anything dealing with sort of like which place has maybe more rich nutrients, or which thing is more more energetically favorable to feed at. I do know with animals, you know, it's sort of, again, this decision of, well, I could eat this and I could go here because this is the really good food is here, but maybe, you know, there's also much bigger predators that have a better chance of catching you. So we haven't implemented any kind of, for lack of better words, decision making to do that yet. But that's something we definitely want to get into. We figured this was probably a good, since we haven't done it, let's see if we can even stand up on all fours, and then we'll stand up on twos, and then we'll take a step. So
Sure. Yeah. And there are a lot of layers to that problem for sure. I will have a chance to talk a little bit, I think in a half hour, a little bit more. It's interesting because
I'm looking forward to it.
I've approached this problem very much wearing an engineer's hat and forgetting about the question of, well, how do animals find food? Food's their resource. Anyway, I'm interested in discussing more about your perspectives. I can share some of the work that we've done as well. Thank you.
I look forward to it.
All right. Well, I think we're right on time here. 2 minutes shy of 11. So we'll call it there. Brian, thank you for the really interesting talk. If anybody wants to connect with Brian, you know, reach out to me and I can make that connection. But thank you again, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Take care, everybody.